Hello, history friends. Welcome back to my channel, Historical USA, where we discover the people, places, and events that made America. I am your host, historian Lisa Weekland, and in this episode, we are talking about the Boston Tea Party. But before we get to the dramatic events of that fateful night, let's set the stage with the Tea Act of 1773, a law that would ignite this revolution. Now, on May 10th, 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. But what did this really mean to the colonists? Now, imagine this. The British East India Company, once a very powerful entity, was drowning in debt. About £400,000 a year, to be exact. The British government, a large benefactor to the East India Trade Company, was desperate to save this economic giant. And they thought they could use the colonies as a lifeline. To put it in more modern terms, Parliament felt that the East India Company, the British East India Company, was too big to fail. However, the Tea Act was not just about saving the company. It really was the final straw in a long line of unpopular policies. The colonists had already been simmering with resentment over taxes imposed by Britain, especially the tax on tea that had lingered since the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767. While most taxes from the Townshend Act were repealed in 1770, the tea tax remained. It was a symbol of Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. And the Tea Act was seen as a direct attack on colonial merchants who were now being undercut by the British East India Company's monopoly. Now, as ships laden with British tea arrived in colonial ports, the reaction was swift. The Sons of Liberty were pretty united on how they were going to handle this. And in cities like Philadelphia, New York, colonists refused to allow the tea to be unloaded. And for many ports, the ships were sent back to England as a way of protesting against what they viewed as an unjust, tyrannical law. But as the ships Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor docked in Boston, the clock began to tick. See, under the Townshend Revenue Act, the tax on tea had to be paid within 20 days of arrival. If not, the ship and their precarious cargo would be seized. The deadline for the Dartmouth was December 17th, and that's important. The Sons of Liberty, led by the passionate Samuel Adams, wasted no time. As soon as the Dartmouth docked in Boston Harbor on November 29th, the pamphlets began flooding the streets, urging the citizens to rise against what they called the detested tea, proclaiming, quote, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, the worst of plagues, the detest tea shipped for this port by the East India Company is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction, or mainly opposition to the machinations of tyranny, stares you now in the face." And meetings sprang up daily in taverns and meeting houses all across Boston as the people began to unite in their opposition. The next day after the Dartmouth had landed in the harbor, a pivotal meeting occurred at Faneuil Hall. As the crowd swelled to thousands, it became clear that the people of Boston were ready to take a stand. The meeting was quickly moved to the Old South Meeting House, which was a larger venue in the city. Samuel Adams stood before the assembly, declaring that the tea must not only be sent back, but that no duty should be paid. The crowd erupted in cheers, and the decision was made to prevent the unloading of the tea. As December approached, tensions escalated. See, the arrival of two more ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, added to this urgency. Governor Thomas Hutchinson's orders prevented any ship from leaving without a pass. And the Sons of Liberty placed about 25 men to stand guard at Griffin's Wharf to barricade and prevent the British East India Company tea from being unloaded, creating immense tension around the issue. Now, the next day, the tea co-signees, this is a group of prominent merchants and loyalists who were appointed by the British East India Company to handle the shipment of their tea. Now, they met in the Old South Meeting House to try and cool tension building in the city. Until the co-signees heard otherwise from London, the tea co-signees suggested storing the tea from the British East India Company and allowing the Sons of Liberty to check it. Because consenting to the tea co-signees' suggestion would have required paying the fine to unload the tea from the Dartmouth, the thousands present at the gathering booed and rejected the proposal. The Patriots and the tea co-signees were in the midst of reaching a solution when Thomas Hutchinson, governor and also the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, interrupted the discussions with a proclamation of his own. Embrace the imminent danger and disperse from any additional unlawful proceedings, the proclamation warned. The meeting's response to Hutchinson's unsigned order and warning read as follows. It was solemnly voted by the body of the people of this and the neighboring towns assembled at the Old South Meeting House on Tuesday, the 30th day of November, that the said tea never should have been landed in this province. Weeks would pass, and the tension would build. No one was budging, and on December 14th, another meeting was convened, drawing thousands once more. The atmosphere was electric, and the resolve to act against the British was palpable. But the time was running out. On the morning of December 16th, the crowd had gathered once again. With the deadline looming, it was decided that Francis Roche, whose family owned the Dartmouth and the Beaver, would plead with Hutchinson for permission to leave Boston Harbor. But Hutchinson's answer was a resounding no. See, with the standoff happening between the Sons of Liberty and Governor Hutchinson, the ship captains were essentially just stuck in limbo. Without official authorization, the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor's owners and captains were unwilling to risk the possible destruction of their ships in an attempt to depart Boston. Castle Williams, the fort that guarded the entrance of Boston Harbor, or British warships might seize those ships if they tried to escape. Really, all the captains and crews could do is wait at Griffin's Wharf to wait their destiny. With the final diplomatic efforts exhausted, Samuel Adams declared, quote, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." The signal was given and the Sons of Liberty sprang into action. Cries of huzzah and "Make Boston Harbor a teapot tonight" resonated throughout the Old South Meeting House. Dressed in makeshift Indian dress, a symbol of their defiance, the Sons of Liberty marched to Griffin's Wharf. Eyewitness accounts described the scene as they boarded the ship, axes in hand, ready to destroy the tea. One witness wrote, "They mustered, I am told, upon Fort Hill to the number of about 200 and proceeded 2 by 2 to Griffin's Wharf, where Hall, Bruce, and Coffin lay, each with 114 chests of the ill-fated article on board. And before 9 o'clock in the evening, every chest from on board the 3 vessels was knocked to pieces and flung over the sides. They say the actors were Indians from Narragansett. Whether they were or not, to a transient observer, they appeared as such, being clothed in blankets with their heads muffled, and copper-colored countenances, being each armed with a hatchet or axe, and pair of pistols, nor was their dialect different from what I conceived these geniuses to speak, as their jargon was unintelligible to all but themselves. witness John Andrews. In a matter of hours, 340 chests of tea, $1.7 million in today's money, were smashed open and dumped into Boston Harbor. Andrews continued to write in a letter on December 18th, quote, 10,000 pounds sterling of the East India Company's tea was destroyed the night, or rather the evening before last. The British East India Company reported 9,659 pounds sterling worth of damage were caused by the Boston Tea Party. The ships, however, were completely untouched. The Sons of Liberty were extremely cautious during this process, making sure that it was the tea and the tea alone that was destroyed. Now, following the destruction of the tea, the players returned and relocated objects to their original location, and they even washed the deck of the ship. The crews of the ships would verify that apart from the loss of their tea shipments, none of the ships had sustained any damage. The act was both a protest and a declaration of independence from British rule. Many of the Boston Tea Party participants fled Boston immediately after the destruction of the tea to avoid arrest. George Hughes remembered, quote, "We then quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other or taking any measures to discover who our associates were. There appeared to be an understanding that each individual should volunteer his services, keep his own secret, and risk the consequences for himself. No disorder took place during that transaction, and it was observed at that time that the stillest night ensued that Boston had enjoyed for many months. Only one member of the Sons of Liberty, a Francis Akeley, was even caught and imprisoned for his participation in the Tea Party. And he is the only person to ever be arrested for the incident. No one died during the Boston Tea Party. There was no violence and no confrontation between the Patriots, the Tories, or British soldiers garrisoned in Boston. None of the members of the crews of the Beaver, Dartmouth, or Eleanor were harmed. This really was the first organized act of rebellion against British rule, and the Sons of Liberty were very, very careful about how the Tea Party was planned and executed. Now, to keep looters from salvaging the British East India Company tea dumped into the harbor, the Sons of Liberty would go out in boats and hit the tea with oars and clubs in an attempt to sink it, in hopes of making the tea absolutely useless. Now, news of the Boston Tea Party spread quickly, and it reached London by January of 1774. The British response was swift and it was severe, leading to the intolerable acts and further uniting the colonies in their fight for freedom. John Adams would write to his dear friend James Warren the day after the Boston Tea Party, quote, "The die is cast. The people have passed the river and cut away the bridge. Last night, 3 cargoes of tea were emptied into the harbor. This is the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened." Today, the Boston Tea Party remains a defining moment in American history, symbolizing the fight against tyranny and the birth of a nation. There's not a school child in America that hasn't heard of the Boston Tea Party. It is that important. And as we reflect on this bold act of rebellion, we are reminded of the power of unity and the courage to stand against injustice.